workshop today we've got this lovely old Scots pine. This came from the same collection as the larch I did for you a couple of weeks ago. If you remember, we took it off a slab and put it in a pot. Now, what makes this tree particularly special to me is the fact that it was grown from seed. The seed was planted in the late 70s and it's been in a bonsai pot ever since, which is probably why it's taken so long to develop. But because we don't have the long heritage of bonsai in this country, any tree like this is to me a little bit special, because it's been produced entirely here pretty much from absolutely nothing. Now, when I got this tree, it was just a massive ball of foliage. It hadn't been pruned for several years, and so it was just very dense, very congested. So the first thing I had to do was clean a lot of the dead material out that had built up inside, and then at the end of the summer I pruned it hard to start to trigger some back budding and also to help to balance the vigour. And already that's worked, because the bud size here is the same as the bud size here, and all of these branches are very even, so we don't have any weak spots. We're not going to be losing any branches here, and this tree is not in particularly bad health. But I'm not going to be wiring and styling this tree at this moment, because the growth is thin, it's floppy, and the wiring just really wouldn't help us to do much. So the focus of work today is going to be to get into this pot, because I'm fairly sure this hasn't been repotted in 20 or 25 years. Once I've got this repotted and the new root develops, then we will see much more compact and tighter growth. So over then the subsequent next couple of 3 years, I'll be able to prune this in such a way that will produce much denser foliage and much tighter needle growth, and then we can wire the tree, and that will produce a much more satisfactory result. Giving you a closer look at this tree, you can see what I was saying about the growth being fairly leggy and fairly thin, because a lot of this, you bear in mind, was growing in the shade of the stuff that I've removed with the previous pruning. But if you look here, you can see the lowest branch, you can see the size of the buds here, and if we run up the tree, and you can see at the top here, in the apex you would normally expect to see much bigger buds, but here you can see the previous pruning has worked quite well, because all the buds are nice and even. Got one or two shoots here that I've left blind, because the tree has got a reasonable amount of strength, and so that's going to throw up back budding as the summer goes on. But this is really very much the first stage in the restoration of this tree. So during the autumn, early autumn, I say it was pruned back, and over last summer we were getting some fertilizer into it, and it's really settled down quite well. You can see here, big lump at the bottom, perhaps not the best Nabari, but you know what, it is what it is. And for me, the overall effect for a homegrown tree is really pretty good. First rule of repotting a tree like this beautiful old craggy bark has taken decades to develop on this tree, and so we don't touch it. No hands on this bark at any point, because all of that lovely craggy bark can be wrecked in a single repot. So we need to handle this tree very carefully. To get this tree out of its pot, we need a rubber hammer. There is one root ball. So looking closely at this, you can see a little bit of mycelium here, but not a lot. It doesn't look as though we've got too much root dieback, but what I can see here, we've definitely got some old-fashioned bonsai soil in there. Looks like a bit of John Innes, possibly even some garden soil. Overall, for a Scots pine, this has that's not been repotted in decades, it's not bad, as you can see. But like here, you can see the garden soil. I think this should clean out fairly well, but once we get this into a new modern soil, that mycelium is really going to flourish, and that's going to make such a difference to the growth of this tree. Now, were I familiar with what's in this pot and had the roots of this been dealt with correctly in the first place, what I might have done is just put a saw through here, chop the bottom off, and then raked out what's left behind. But I don't really know what I've got inside this, because obviously I've never been in it, and I doubt anybody could remember seeing it's not been done for so long. So I am going to have to rake this out until we get down to something decent. Generally you'll find the outside is quite impenetrable, but as soon as you get through the first little bit of root, you tend to find the soil inside comes out a lot easier. So here I'm just using my favourite repotting tool. This is a rake tweezer. I don't use it as a tweezer, but it makes for a really good two-pronged chopstick. And it's quite hard to see here, but most of the root in the bottom of this pot has died off. I'm guessing it's been very wet over the winter. And nice bit of plastic netting in the bottom there, and here you can see straight away we're right into this this soil. So we get this, we tend to get with pines, we tend to get this little carpet of root on the outside, and as soon as we get past that, you can see the soil underneath here is coming out really easy. We use this little rake, but we don't just rake and draw because that rips everything apart. So what we do is just use it to lightly fluff up the soil. That comes out without tearing everything to pieces. As you can see, this is pretty solid in here, but there's very little root, which is very typical of this old John Innes type soil-based mix. We get a lot of root around the outside, very little in the middle. And that's one of the reasons why this tree is not perhaps as vigorous as we might like it to be, and the whole reason for doing this work in the first place. You can see now I'm getting into it, this soil is fairly compacted, but it's not compacted because it's so full of root or dead material. It's compacted because it's soil, and this is one of the reasons why we don't use garden soil for bonsai anymore. You leave it in a pot long enough and water just consolidates it, it becomes solid. And as you can see, we've got relatively little root growth in this as opposed to what's on the outside, because on the outside between the soil and the pot is where there tends to be the most air and also the most water, and so as a consequence that's where all the root develops. But what we want, and what we're going to do today, is get this into a smaller pot, but with a good soil mix it's going to grow much more strongly, even though there's going to be significantly less volume in the pot. Now I know that in general we would move a tree like this into a bigger pot in order to increase the vigour, but this being the Scots pine, it doesn't play by the rules that some things tend to, and so by cleaning this out and getting this into a smaller pot, we'll be able to really increase the vigour of this in the next couple of years. Okay, so now I've cleaned out most of the soil on this, right to the base of this trunk, and you can see we've got absolutely loads of root. Now if we had a Scots pine that perhaps wasn't so well established, we might keep all of this root, put it in the new pot and put new soil around it. Scots pines are not a tree that typically has huge masses of root, but obviously in this case we've got more than enough, so it turns out I probably could have just put a saw through this. So what I will do now is just take some of the weight off this, because it's not all going to go in the pot that we've got. Like I say, if your tree's not got a lot of root like this one, gather it all up and put it back in the pot with new soil in amongst it. Pines tend not to produce roots in quite the same way that deciduous trees do, so we don't want to be chopping this back right to thick wood, because it can potentially cause some problems if the tree doesn't issue new roots from where we've cut. But when we cut these small roots, they tend to produce new roots very quickly, and so the tree picks up. Usually within a couple of weeks you'll see the normal growth will resume and no more problem. So you can see here I've chased this right back to the base of the trunk, and so that's practically as clean as we need to do. And one of the issues you have with pines is obviously they have mycelium, which helps them to grow. It's a type of fungus in the soil, and on the surface of the soil that will tend to skin over because there's lots of oxygen there, and so the mycelium grows at that point. And so usually we end up with this quite hard crust on a Scots pine, or most pines in fact. And so what we want to do is just break that away. You can see, even though this is really hard, pulling it out, there's very little root at this point, but if we don't clean this skin off, it's going to be impossible to get water into here going forwards. The great thing about this tool is when it gets really dense, the spike on the end is very good at getting in between the roots and just opening everything up. So the pot we're going to use for this tree is this lovely old Japanese Tokonoma pot that I turned up under the bench, and it's got a lovely patina and it's just the right shape to put this in. So first thing we need to do, now the pot's all meshed up, so a little bit of soil in the bottom. The soil mix I'm using here is predominantly pumice with a little bit of charcoal and some molar. Pumice is very good with pines because it promotes the growth of mycelium, and so it's really going to help this tree to establish very quickly. And looking at this, you can see I've trimmed this as much as is reasonably required. You see that's going to sit in there just fine. I haven't cleaned this out as much as I might like because the tree is obviously a little bit weak and we've reduced the root mass by about 2/3. So a lot of this is going to stay, but on the subsequent repots we can get in and start to clean more of this out. But I have cleaned directly underneath, right to the base of the trunk, so obviously that area is going to regenerate very quickly. So now we just need to get this wired into position. I want it slightly raised in the pot. It'll look a lot better that way. And so we use 2 wires through the drainage holes just to secure that in place. So once those wires are tightened down, you can see the pot's all nicely secured. So as we begin to work this soil, and we obviously want to get in there and push it underneath the root ball, and the best way to do that is get in there with your fingers, and then you can really feel if there are any voids under there that obviously we want to fill. Because this is a relatively small pot, the last thing we want is to have a big hole underneath there with no soil in it, because that's going to be a large proportion of the pot that's not going to produce anything for the tree. So it's worth spending some time at this stage to get in there and really get that soil nicely worked in all amongst those roots. Make sure we've got all the voids filled, it's all nice and tightly packed. And obviously using a soil like this, it doesn't matter really what we do with it, it's not going to compact. It doesn't matter how hard we squash that, you can see that's just going to settle in there all on its own. Using a chopstick to work the soil into the root ball, what we don't want to be doing is just stabbing. What we need to do is get that stick in there and move it around us so that the end just gradually settles all those particles into all the spaces we've got there and in between all the roots that we've left. So we're not just stabbing, we're using the stick to move the soil into position. The best thing to do is just small amounts of soil and just work it in little by little rather than dumping too much in all at once. So now we just give this a good water, and just run the water in there, and so until it runs clean out of the bottom of the pot. It carries all the dust and muck out as well, as you can see here. Lots of dust and muck coming out of there. So while this soil is nice and open, that's an ideal opportunity to get that all washed through nice and clean. I always give a tree a good thorough soaking to make sure everything's nice and wet, and also that, as you can see here, the water's now running clean, and so we know all the dust and muck has largely been taken out of the bottom of that pot. So now the last job on this tree is to get some moss on this soil surface. Because the soil we're using here is fairly coarse, so it's fairly loose, we obviously want to hold that all in place, otherwise as we're watering the soil will tend to wash away. But the other thing that moss will do is trap the moisture in the very surface of this soil. If we didn't moss it, you would find that the top 3/4 of an inch would dry out very quickly, and that will really slow down the development of root in the surface of that soil. So by keeping a little covering of moss on here, it's going to keep the soil moist, which means that the mycelium will very quickly get through there, and the roots will quickly follow, and so ultimately this tree will grow in all of this soil rather than just a little bit at the bottom. This is thin moss. It's come off concrete paving. It's nice and clean on the back, so we're not putting anything into this root ball that shouldn't be here, apart from 1 or 2 weeds, I guess. And so we just want to take small pieces of moss at a time and arrange that. Just press it down into that soil. Okay, that's the end of the repotting of this tree, and aftercare, this will go into a corner of the garden in the sunshine, but out of the wind, and within a week it will be generating new roots, and it will continue on its growth phase. So I will then come back to this tree. It'll get a light prune at the end of the summer. We won't be pinching any candles or anything, so we'll expect to see the vigor of this tree increase quite significantly between now and the end of the year. And in terms of repotting, we'll come back to this in 2 years' time and be able to get in here and work a little bit more magic on this. But for now, this is more than enough to help this tree to move forwards. We will see the vigor of it increase, the growth of it will improve, and so this is one small step towards really refining this tree and bringing it back to what it should be, or perhaps what it was at one time. But as with all of these things in bonsai, it's lots of small steps that we have to take, and so today this is just one small step in the restoration of this tree. So hopefully this has been informative and helpful on some levels. So thanks for watching.